Hey, welcome to Capturing Christianity. I am Cameron Bertuzzi. Tonight, or today, we've got a debate. It's a sort of an informal debate on Christian and Muslim views on the crucifixion. I've got Dr. David Wood and Dr. Khalil Andani with me today. And yeah, we're just going to have a sort of informal dialogue. We've got 10-minute openings planned for each of the debaters tonight, and then we're just going to do some open dialogue for about an hour and then take some Q&A. That's kind of how the stream is going to go. I think you're going to be surprised, or this is not a sort of typical debate that you're going to watch on this topic. So it's going to be really, really entertaining, really fun, and then also hopefully productive. Like hopefully we're going to actually make some progress in this conversation. So let me just share a little bit about my two guests today. So Dr. Khalil Andani is an assistant professor of religion at Augustana College. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. He holds a PhD and MA in Islamic Studies and a Master of Theological Studies from Harvard University. Khalil is a scholar of Islamic intellectual history and a Muslim philosopher of religion, and has published several articles in various academic journals and edited volumes. Khalil is currently writing his first book, a historical and analytical study of Muslim concepts of revelation, based on his award-winning PhD dissertation. Now, David Wood is going to be a whole lot more well-known. He's even more well-known than myself, like Capturing Christianity. So he doesn't need too much of an introduction, but if you've never heard of him, he earned a doctorate in philosophy from Fordham University, and then he's also most well-known for his YouTube videos in which he opposes and criticizes Islam on his ministry is called Acts 17. So yeah, so that's basically the introduction for my two guests. If you'd like to learn more about them, check the description of this video. But if you know much about the debates that I host on my channel, I try not to spend too much time on intros. We're just going to get right into the meat. So as I said, we're going to do 10-minute openings from each debater, followed by open dialogue. We're going to start with Khalil. So Khalil, whenever you're ready, we're going to go for about 10 minutes, but we discussed prior to the stream that we're totally cool if we go a little bit over that. It's no big deal. So whenever you're ready, just go ahead and begin. I'll start my timer.
Thanks. I'm just sharing my screen if you want to put that up.
Sure. Yeah, I see it there. Let me 1 second while I go ahead and pull that up. All right, it should be live now, and then whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and begin.
Okay, let's just load the slide up here. All right. Well, thank you so much, Cameron, for this invitation. Thank you to Dr. David Wood for being here. Let me just say that I think Capturing Christianity has been a very good resource for strongly argued Christian apologetics and philosophy. When I am looking for that sort of stuff, either for myself or for my students, I do consult the channel. So thank you, Cameron, for doing us a great service. And I'm also pleased that you invited me and in general that you're open to having academically trained Muslim thinkers also on the channel to have these important dialogues. So I'm going to talk about the Quran and the crucifixion and try to offer some perspective on this. I am a historian of religion, so a lot of what I'm saying is based on a critical historical reading of sources. And I'm also, in my own right, a Muslim philosopher. I also publish in that area. So I can take both historical and philosophical perspectives on some of these issues. So just for some big picture, many people don't know, but Islam is a diverse umbrella of legal, theological, and spiritual traditions. And most of the dialogues that happen between Christians and Muslims, unfortunately, they only feature one type of Islam or one version of Islam. That tends to be louder in modern times. But there are other versions of Islam. And you'll be hearing about some of these other versions from me in our dialogue today. So I've put here on the left of the screen a list of Christian theological claims that I'm sure the whole audience is familiar with, and I'm sure many people watching and both Cameron and David are used to arguing for these claims. So the question is, which of these claims that you see on the left can Muslims accept, or do Muslims accept? So some of these claims Muslims do. That is, almost all Muslims accept these blue check mark claims that there's one God, that Jesus was God's prophet and his Messiah, that Jesus was a mediator between man and God, that God raised Jesus to his presence. All Muslims accept that. Then there's a set of claims here that Muslims can accept, and that there are versions of Islam that can accept some of the other Christian claims, and those are in the lighter blue check marks. Muslims can accept that Jesus pre-exists the physical world. There's a very popular belief that all prophets pre-exist the physical world. Muslims can accept that Jesus was a manifestation of a pre-eternal logos of God. Muslims can accept that Jesus was crucified, that he died on the cross. Muslims can also accept that God raised Jesus from the dead in some form or another. So that's actually all acceptable. Muslims can also accept that the death and suffering of Jesus was a redemptive suffering or a moral exemplar type of suffering. Then there are what you could call the red lines. And I've highlighted 3 here, things that Muslims cannot accept. So Muslims cannot accept that Jesus was worshipped as God. They cannot accept that Jesus was the Son of God, pre-eternal and uncreated in the Trinity. And Muslims cannot accept that Jesus' death and suffering was a vicarious substitutionary atonement for human sin. So I just want to show you guys the playing field first. Now let's talk about the issue. What does the Quran say about Jesus' death and crucifixion? So in the field of academic Quranic studies, when we try to answer these questions, we first do a deep analysis of the actual Quranic text. So an intra-Quranic analysis. So the verses that you're probably familiar with are here. This is in Quran Surah 4, where it says, "And for their saying, we killed the Messiah, Jesus, son of Mary, the messenger of God, yet they did not kill him, neither crucified him. It was only made to appear so to them." And then it goes on to say at the end that God raised him, Jesus, up to himself. That this is what most people see. And most people look at this and they say, oh, well, the Quran outright denies the death and crucifixion of Jesus. I would venture to say that this is actually not really true. This is not necessarily true. We have to first look at what is the larger block of text that this passage appears in. Who is they and who is there? Who are these people who claim to have killed Jesus, and the Quran is denying that they did not kill him or crucify him? So we just go back a little bit in the same passage, same surah, several verses before, and we find that there's an entire discourse about the people of the book, and in this context is talking about a certain group of Jews, which the Quran calls people of the book. And here what you have is a list of misdeeds or violations of God's command that certain, not all, but certain Jews, followers of Moses and those tradition, committed. So they are accused of breaking the Sabbath. They're accused of worshiping the golden calf. They are accused of breaking their promises to God, and so on. And at the tail end, they are also accused of slandering the Virgin Mary. And then they are accused of saying that they, that is, certain rebellious Jews, killed Jesus, son of Mary. And the Quran says they did not kill him. They did not crucify him. And by the way, this passage, which is a critique of certain Jews for violating God's commands, you can also find a parallel passage in Nehemiah chapter 9 in the Bible. So this is not an actual denial that Jesus died. It's not a denial of the event of the crucifixion. It is a denial that certain Jewish enemies of Jesus, that they claimed to have killed him. In other parts of the Quran says that actually Jesus did die. There are 2 verses that say God caused Jesus to die. In one of the verses, which is here, God tells Jesus, I will cause you to die. And it's important to note that this verb, tawafa, in Arabic is used all over the Quran to mean God taking a soul at death. And it's repeated again for Jesus in Surah 5. So we can go further. The Quran tells us that it's God who gives life and death. The Quran also says in other places that during a certain battle, when the believers fought and killed their enemies, it was God who killed them. And when Muhammad threw stones to defend himself, it was God who threw that. So the Quran, in the verses about crucifixion, is not denying the crucifixion as a fact. I would propose that the Quran is denying the claimed agency of Jesus' Jewish enemies to have killed him. And the Quran, in other places, is clearly saying that it is God who has agency over life and death. And it is actually God who wills Jesus to die in the way that Jesus died. That is actually very clear in the Quran. And of course, from another perspective, you could say that Jesus is not really dead, because the martyrs who are killed in the way of God, according to the Quran, are not really dead, and you should not say that they are dead. We can also go forward on this, okay? So again, these are the verses I've already looked at. I would propose that if we read the Quran intertextually with the Bible, we'll find more agreement than disagreement. And I think what the Quran is saying in these passages, again, the same ones we've gone over, I think this parallels what Peter reportedly says in the book of Acts. So Peter says to the Israelites, quote, Jesus, a man accredited by God, this man was handed over to you by God's deliberate plan and foreknowledge. So notice, Peter is saying that Jesus' death at the hands of the Israelites was by God's plan. He's taking away their agency as well. And then you also have that God raised Jesus, which the Quran also says, by the way, God raised him up. So there's some agreement. And again, Jesus himself taught that do not fear him who can kill only the body but not the soul. Fear him who can destroy both soul and body. So from an esoteric perspective, the Jewish enemies of Jesus could only kill his body. They could not kill his soul, which again ties to the Quranic verses about martyrs. Now, there's another context we can look at, again, as an academic. Who is the they? And again, we already saw that they refers to certain Jewish enemies of Jesus. So did certain Jewish scholars claim that they killed Jesus? Well, it turns out they did. In the Babylonian Talmud, we find an anti-Christian polemic against Jesus and Mary. So first, in the Talmud, in Sanhedrin 106, Mary is accused of being a harlot, of committing adultery. Notice how the Quran refers to the Jewish enemies of Jesus slandering Mary in those verses. Then, in another part of the Babylonian Talmud, it is claimed that the Jewish authorities hanged Jesus for blasphemy, and that Jesus was stoned to death, and then he was hanged on Passover. Now, this is not historical, but it is in the Talmud, and it is a claim. And Peter Schaffer, who has studied this, has said that this is exactly what the Talmud is doing. It's doing a parody of what actually happened. So the Talmud is attacking Jesus and Mary polemically. So what is the Quran doing? The Quran is responding to the Talmud. The Quran is saying that no, this certain Jewish claim to have killed Jesus and to slander Mary, that these claims are wrong. And in a sense, the Quran is coming to a defense of Jesus and his mother. It's not attacking them or attacking his status. There's another context, and I know I'm at 10 minutes, so I'll go quickly. There's another context here that's embedded where there was a Christian debate at the time of Prophet Muhammad and 100 years before that over who actually died on the cross. Did Jesus die in his divinity? Did he die in his humanity? Did he die in both? So there's also a Christian debate, confusion about who died on the cross, in what sense did the Son of God die. And the Quran, according to scholar Ryan Elizabeth Craig, the Quran is also speaking to that. So then how did Muslims interpret this over time? Okay, and this is a summary of the different views. So again, what I've presented is what I believe the Quran is saying when you read the Quran historically and critically. Okay, the Quran is not denying the crucifixion. It's just denying Jewish polemics. But then what did Muslims over time and space say? So you find different views. So the view that you probably know, which later became the majority, is a view in Sunni tafsir, which says someone else was put on the cross instead of Jesus. And this is based on a narrative, a story, which itself doesn't really have any supporting sources. It's literally just told as a story. And this is already there in the 700s. But at the same time, we have another view from certain Shia scholars, including the Ismailis, that Jesus did die on the cross. He was crucified in terms of his body, but he was exalted to God in terms of his spirit. So these views were both there, and they were competing with each other. We also have some evidence that perhaps Al-Ghazali, who's Sunni, also affirmed the crucifixion. Now, if we go to the post-classical period, again, the main view in Sunni tafsir continues to be substitution, but there are some cracks in this. So Fakhruddin Razi, who's a very famous Sunni scholar, he, in his tafsir, was critical of the substitution story, that someone else was crucified instead. In the modern period, we have a variety of views. We still have substitution being promoted. But we also have the swoon theory by certain modernist Muslims that say Jesus survived the crucifixion. And then we have some confessional academic scholarship from Muslims, which is casting doubt on the historicity of the crucifixion. And then finally, in modern times, we have much of modern academia, so modern academic scholars, Muslim and non Muslim, who still say that the Quran does not deny the death and crucifixion of Jesus, it only resituates it. What is the view that I follow? Well, I follow basically the modern academic view, which tends to match the pre modern Shia Ismaili view, which affirms the crucifixion. So that's where I'm coming from. Of course, I have respect for all the different views, and we can talk about all of them, but this is sort of what I think is the best reading of the Quran. And I'll end with this quote, which, I hope Cameron and other Christians keep in mind. According to Henry Corbin, the conditions of the dialogue between Christianity and Islam change completely as soon as the interlocutor represents not legalistic Islam, but this spiritual Islam, whether it be that of Sufism or of Shiite Gnosis. So I hope that what I've shared with you will advance the dialogue between Muslims and Christians, and it's very important to have dialogues with diverse groups of Christians and Muslims. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Khalil. Now we'll move into David Wood's opening statement, which is again around 10 minutes. We went about 13 minutes, so David, feel free to take as long, and then we'll move from there into open dialogue.
You hear me?
Yep.
Okay, cool. Well, thank you, Cameron, for hosting, and thank you, Khalil, for that opening presentation. Cam, you called this a debate, but I think it's going to be more like 2 hours of me enthusiastically nodding in agreement with Khalil, because I agree with a lot of what he said in his opening there. And I'll point out in agreement that it has been difficult for me over the years to read Surah 4, verse 157 of the Quran without seeing it through the specific lens of substitution theory, the theory that Allah disguised someone else and made him look like Jesus, because that's just what I always heard long before I even was reading the Quran. But after many discussions and debates on this topic, I can now say I'm no longer convinced that the Quran denies the crucifixion and death of Jesus. I'm definitely not convinced that the Quran supports the idea that Judas or someone else was crucified in Jesus' place. And if it was difficult for me, an outsider and a critic, to read what the Quran says without being massively influenced by later commentators, I can only imagine how difficult it must be for Muslims to read this verse without assuming that it promotes the view they've heard all their lives from their sheikhs, imams, da'is, apologists, families, and friends. But I have a question here at the beginning for all of the Muslims who are watching. You believe that the Quran is the speech of Allah. You believe that Surah 4, verse 157 is the speech of Allah. And so the question is, if Allah isn't saying what you think he's saying, if most Muslim scholars have misunderstood this verse for a variety of reasons, if you've been given a false interpretation of Allah's words, do you want to know it? In other words, if you're wrong about what 4157 means, would you want to know it, or would you rather continue believing an incorrect interpretation of what Allah said about Jesus? If you're open to the idea that there may be some better ways of understanding what the Quran says about the crucifixion, I invite you to carefully consider Khalil's opening remarks, and I'll just add a few additional thoughts. In case you're new to this topic, Jesus' death by crucifixion is considered a fact of history by historical Jesus scholars and New Testament scholars, regardless of their theological background. The scholarly consensus on Jesus' death arises from one, having a variety of ancient sources reporting that Jesus was crucified, And two, knowing how crucifixion works. We have Christian, Jewish, and Roman sources reporting Jesus' execution, and our understanding of Roman crucifixion practices pretty well rules out any speculations about Jesus surviving his execution. Today, we tend to think of crucifixion as just nailing someone to a cross, but Roman crucifixion was a three-step process. The first step was the scourging, which was sometimes called the half death because victims would be half dead by the time just the beating was finished. The Romans used a flagrum made of leather thongs with chunks of bone or metal woven into the strands, which was designed to remove human flesh. We have records of people being beaten until their veins and arteries were exposed, or until their bones were showing, or until their intestines spilled out. And that was just the first step. Step two was nailing the victim to a cross and letting him hang there while the blood drained out of him. Once he stopped gasping for breath, the Romans knew their work was done. Almost. There was still the matter of what to do with the body. Generally, the Romans would leave a corpse on the cross and let it rot and be torn apart and eaten by wild birds and jackals. But if they needed to pry someone off a cross, they would stab him through the heart with a sword or a spear, some sort of death blow, just to make sure the person was dead. Not the sort of process anyone's going to walk away from. So Jesus' death isn't simply a point of Christian doctrine. This isn't just, the Jesus of faith type situation. It's a fact of history, as even non-Christian scholars are happy to admit. A couple of examples. Atheist New Testament scholar Gerd Ludemann declares that Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. John Dominic Crossan of the infamous Jesus Seminar says that there is not the slightest doubt about the fact of Jesus' crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Marcus Borg, another member of the Jesus Seminar, states that Jesus' execution is the most certain fact about the historical Jesus. Jewish scholar Pinchas Lapid concludes that Jesus' death by crucifixion is, quote, historically certain. According to Paula Fredrickson, a convert to Judaism, the single most solid fact about Jesus' life is his death. He was executed by the Roman prefect Pilate on or around Passover in the manner Rome reserved particularly for political insurrectionists, namely crucifixion. And Bart Ehrman maintains one of the most certain facts of history is that Jesus was crucified on orders of the Roman prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate. Notice that these non-Christian scholars and writers aren't simply saying that we have some evidence that Jesus died by crucifixion. They're saying it's indisputable, that it's historically certain, that it's one of the most certain facts of history. So I'll call the view that Jesus actually died by crucifixion realism. Call that realism. What people saw happen and what scholars are convinced happened really happened. It wasn't a trick or an illusion. There have always been some Muslim realists with regard to the crucifixion, Muslims who believe that Jesus did die by crucifixion, but realism has always been a minority position in Islam. There are two non-realist theories that are far more popular among Muslims. There's the substitution theory that Allah replaced Jesus with another person, and what I'll call theistic swoon theory, the theory that Allah miraculously kept Jesus alive throughout the agony of the crucifixion process. This latter theory, theistic swoon theory, is especially associated with Ahmadi Muslims, although non-Ahmadis such as Ahmed Deedat, Zakir Naik, and Shabir Ali have all defended it. Khalil pointed that out. Shabir Ali seems to believe this theory. I don't think Ahmed Deedat actually believed it. I don't think Zakir Naik actually believes it. I suspect they defended it because they knew that substitution theory sounds absolutely ridiculous to non-Muslims. So maybe they thought that the swoon theory would be a better option for defending in debate. So what's wrong with substitution theory? A bunch of things. First, the Quran says nothing about Allah taking another person and disguising him to make him look like Jesus. This, as Khalil pointed out, comes from later commentaries. None of these commentaries goes back to Muhammad, and they contradict each other on almost every detail. Second, there's only one verse in the Quran that can even be interpreted as promoting the substitution myth, and the verse is open to a number of alternative explanations by simply comparing it with other Quran verses, as Khalil showed. Third, we know where substitution theory originated. It originated among the Gnostics and Docetists, two groups that had nothing whatsoever in common with Islam. These groups are further removed from Islam than Christianity is. So if the author of the Quran was taking this theory from the Docetists, that is a major problem for the Quran. But if later commentators got this idea somehow, or were influenced by the Docetists, that's a problem for the commentators, not for the Quran. Fourth, substitution theory portrays Allah as a malicious deceiver. If Jesus didn't actually die, but Allah made people think that Jesus died, the real reason billions of people are now convinced that Jesus died is that Allah did an outstanding job tricking everyone. I mean, if the substitution theory is correct, the reason that Khalil now believes there was a crucifixion, and that I believe there was a crucifixion, and that Cameron believes that there's a crucifixion, is because Allah just did such a great job tricking everyone that we're still tricked by this. We know that Jesus' followers became convinced that he died as well. We know that Jesus' followers went out preaching his death by crucifixion. According to the substitution myth, where did they get that idea? They got it from Allah, because Allah is the one who tricked people into believing that. But according to the Quran, Jesus' followers were devout Muslims. So if these devout Muslim followers of Jesus were deceived, we can conclude that Allah deceives even the people who follow his prophets. And if that's acceptable, then wow. Fifth, the Islamic view portrays Jesus as a failure. The Jesus of the Quran spent years preaching Islam only to have his life's work sabotaged by Allah, who convinced the world that Jesus died by crucifixion, ultimately giving rise to Christianity. According to the Quran, again, they were devout Muslims, but they must have disappeared rather quickly without so much as a whimper, because we have no records of Jesus' followers who didn't believe in his crucifixion. So the Islamic Jesus didn't win a single lasting convert, and he accomplished absolutely nothing of any lasting significance if we stick to substitution theory. I'll just quote, in the words of Sheikh Imran Hussein, substitution theory is pathetic nonsense. That's not me, that's from a Muslim. So what's the alternative? Well, there are several realist interpretations of 4.157. If you read 4.157 completely on its own, it does sound like it's denying the reality of Jesus' crucifixion and death. If you read it in context, you realize that the verse isn't critiquing Christian beliefs about Jesus. As Khalil pointed out, it's critiquing various misdeeds of a group of Jews. 4.157 is correcting their boast that they had killed the Messiah. Even without this surrounding context, it still sounds, even with this surrounding context, it still sounds like it's denying Jesus' crucifixion and death. But when you read 4.157 in context, along with certain other Quran verses in the extended literary context, I agree with Khalil, you do start to get a different picture. If you were to read 355, 5.117, and 1933 without thinking of substitution theory, you'd get the impression that the Quran acknowledges Jesus' death. And if you read 3.145, 3.169, 8.17, 39.42, verses like this, and then you go to 4.157, you start to get the impression that the Quran is only claiming that even though Jesus was killed by crucifixion, he wasn't really killed by these Jewish boasters, either because it was all part of Allah's plan or because you simply can't kill someone like Jesus since his soul lives on. So if you read 4.157 without the greater context, substitution theory fits pretty well. But if you interpret the Quran with the Quran, Khalil's position starts to look stronger and stronger. So 4.157 allows multiple interpretations, but if I were a Muslim, I'd go with the interpretation that doesn't portray Allah as a horrible deceiver who leads people into error for no apparent reason.
All right, yeah, that was just about 13 minutes. So, as I mentioned at the very beginning of this is going to be a very unique debate because, I mean, the way that it's sort of set up, it does seem like the debate is kind of over. There was really no debate, but the sort of point of this dialogue today is so that we can kind of see some different views. That was one of the reasons why I wanted to have Dr. Andani on here, is because his views are not some of the more typical views that you see in Muslim apologetics on YouTube. So I think it's going to be good to have a dialogue about it regardless. But the question that I'd like to put to sort of get the dialogue portion going is, Dr. Andani, in your opening, you said that you have respect for the sort of more common, more popular Islamic views on the crucifixion. So maybe we could kind of start there, and you could explain why you respect those views, because obviously David does not respect the substitutionary or swoon theory views. So maybe we could just dialogue about that a little bit, and then move into to other topics.
Sure. So, of course, when I say I respect them, it doesn't mean I agree with them, right? But people who arrive at these other views, whether it's substitution or swoon, uh, we have to have respect for their well intended investigation that leads them to those views, right? People don't arrive at those views because they're bad people, or they're dishonest, or they're not intellectual. What's going on is that people are trying to understand certain verses of the Quran based on the commitments and prior beliefs that they bring to the text, and based on some sort of underlying theology that they have. So, for example, we can ask, well, why did anybody believe in the substitution theory? Like, why was it popular? One reason why it's popular is politics. There was a time where the Sunni Caliphate and the Shi'i Ismaili Caliphate in the 900s and the thousands were actually competing, and at one point it looked like that the Shi'i Ismaili Caliphate was going to win, but that didn't happen. The Sunni political establishment won. And then what tends to happen is that what the views that become more popular, more repeated over time, because the substitution narrative has just been repeated over time, right? Whether it's the modern period, the post-classical, the classical, it's the same thing being repeated. So one function is politics, but at the same time, uh, people who believe in substitution, there's another idea that they have, which we may disagree with, and it may not be a true idea, but this is where they're coming from. So there's this idea, uh, there's a theology of sort of triumphalism, that God does not allow somebody like Jesus to suffer physically, and to be beaten up and disgraced and this sort of thing. So there's a theology of that at the bedrock. And then that leads certain scholars to take the view that, okay, he was not crucified or killed at all. And there's a certain that theology is also influenced, by the political situation at that time. Of course, I don't agree with the substitution theory, for some of the reasons that David cited, but I think we have to be careful about the argument that God, if substitution is true, then God is someone who deceives people. Because, I mean, in the Bible, God deceives people, right? I think in one of the Bible, one of the books, Second Thessalonians, verse 10, or around there, it says that near at the end times, God will send a delusion on the people of the earth. And the unrighteous people will be deluded. And then I also in Revelation, when you have like different beasts who are doing miracles and false prophets, and they're able to do these things, and this is also a form of deception. So I wouldn't use that argument. It makes God into a deceiver, because if you're coming at it from a Christian perspective, someone can just argue back and say, well, certain biblical ideas imply that God does deceive people. But I think the reasoning that we need to remember is the crucifixion of Jesus and the death of Jesus is not a creedal belief in Islam, right? So if you look up a typical Islamic creedal text which says we believe X, we believe Y, believing that Jesus did not get crucified and someone was substituted, or believing that Jesus was crucified, neither of those are essential creedal beliefs. So, whatever Muslims believe about Jesus is what I would call an extracurricular matter. And in those matters, people can speculate all they want. It doesn't really affect a Muslim's belief in Tawheed or the prophethood of Muhammad, or anything of that sort. And tafsir is where we find the substitution story, right? And we need to remember that tafsir is not a prescriptive literature. Creeds, Aqidah is prescriptive literature, but tafsir is not prescriptive. So we have like thousands of tafsir. Many tafsir on a given verse don't even give you one view. Many mufassirun report like 5 views or 4 views or 10 views on what a certain verse could mean, because tafsir is an exploratory activity where the Muslim commentator surveys all the possible meanings of what something could be, and sometimes they pick a meaning and sometimes they don't. So Shabir Ali once told me, and he once told the whole group, that what happened to Jesus from a Muslim perspective, unlike the Christian view, what happened to Jesus from a Muslim view is really a side issue, and it doesn't really have an effect on Muslim salvation history or anything like that. One question I would ask to David, and I'm actually glad that we basically have a strong agreement on this, and to others. So if you agree with what I presented, and if you say that the Quran does not itself deny the crucifixion, are you willing to retract a long-standing apologetic argument that I've heard from David and William Lane Craig and others? And the argument says that the Quran is false because the Quran denies the crucifixion. I've tried to show that the Quran actually does not deny the crucifixion. It certainly doesn't teach substitution. So then are some of the Christian apologists willing to retract that particular argument against the Quran?
So Cameron, should I respond to basically everything Khalil said right there? Like, because he asked the question, you asked the question,
he asked the question.
And he asked the question. So can I respond to both questions, basically?
Yeah. Go ahead and do both.
Okay. I'll try not to go too long here. The question was about substitution theory and the implications. And I do want to add that, even though I see a lot of problems with it, and Muslim commentators, you mentioned Al-Razi, who had a serious problem with substitution theory, because it would, if you can't trust your senses, if I'm looking at a person, I can't know that it's him, because for all I know, God could be disguising someone else and making him look like this some other person. That calls everything into question, legal rulings and so on. I mean, suppose I went out and committed adultery, and then people came to arrest me, and I said, well, it wasn't me, it was Cameron. God disguised Cameron and made him look like me, and so on. This would wreak havoc on just basically living as a human being if we can't trust our own senses. And Al-Razi got that. But with that said, I don't think the vast majority of Muslims who hold to this haven't really thought through it. They're not even thinking about these implications. They're not thinking of God as a deceiver. And in fact, most Muslims who believe it seem to think of this as like evidence of God's superior power and justice. Like, they look at it and say, you Christians believe that God allowed an innocent Jesus to die and his enemies got the victory over him. But in Islam, Allah flipped it and they got Judas or someone else. And so you see how God actually protected Jesus. So in their minds, they're not thinking all the way through to the implications of the theory. They're just thinking, wow, God rescued Jesus, and that's a good thing. And God punished a bad person, and that's a good thing. So it's not like there's a lot of malicious intent behind it. But with that said, the implications are there when people want to actually think about the implications of the theory. So since we do know that Jesus' disciples went out preaching the crucifixion, I think it is a bit more of a problem than what Khalil was saying with if I have a problem with God being a deceiver. If you look at passages in the Bible, like 2 Thessalonians, it's similar to what you have in the Old Testament with where God is Moses is interacting with Pharaoh, and it says Pharaoh hardened his heart, Pharaoh hardened his heart, Pharaoh hardened his heart, Pharaoh hardened his heart, and then all of a sudden it starts saying God hardened Pharaoh's heart, and it's like you just if you really want to go down this route, I'm locking you into it, and that's the impression I get from Second Thessalonians. It talks about Satan deceiving all these people, and then saying God sends them a strong delusion, but it's Satan doing this deceiving that they're going along with. Whereas, and notice to keep in mind, I don't actually have a problem with God tricking someone if there's some sort of good point to it. Like if I was walking down the street and a bunch of guys are going to kill me, and God tricks them into thinking I went one way when I went some other way, I think, okay, I'm fine with that. But when it's specifically in a situation like this where the people who are getting tricked, one, it's everybody. It's not just bad people who are trying to do something awful. It's not bad people who are trying to kill a prophet or something like that. It's everyone. It's even the followers of the prophet, and the implications of that goes even more than what Al-Razi was saying. He's just pointing out, look, if I can't trust my senses, how do I even know I'm talking to you? But if God will trick and deceive even people who follow his prophets. So these are people who, according to the Quran, at the preaching of Jesus, they said, yes, we're Muslims. We follow you. If God will lead even them astray, if God will mislead any of them, it's like, my goodness, how can, now I don't know what to believe, because God will even trick people who are following his prophet. So these are these are some of the concerns I have with substitution theory. And so my overall perspective would be, if the Quran definitely locked you into that position, then obviously as a Muslim, you would have to believe it. But if there are alternative interpretations, if there's another way to interpret this, I would definitely go with the alternative interpretation rather than the one that leads to all of these problems. And so those are my thoughts on that. And then as for your question, am I willing to sort of renounce the claim that the Quran is false because the Quran denies the crucifixion of Jesus? The only problem here is I'm not entirely convinced that it doesn't support substitution theory. I'm not totally convinced of it. So I will give you a qualified response. If the Quran is actually denying the crucifixion and promoting substitution theory, I think that the problems that we point out stand. If it's not saying that, then I would say no. I don't believe the Quran has a real problem on this issue, and that the Quran is not wrong because of this issue. We will obviously have other disagreements with the Quran, but I would not have a problem with this. And so it's going to turn into a situation where it's going to be specific to the person we're engaging with. What do you believe about the Quran, what the Quran is saying here? And if you hold that the Quran is denying the crucifixion theory and saying that Judas or someone else was crucified, then I think you've got a problem. And if you aren't, if you're interpreting this in the light of other Quran passages, then I don't think it's a problem for the Quran. So anyway, it goes back to what I mentioned in my opening. It's where this theory comes in. Either this theory is at the level of the Quran, so either the Quran is promoting the substitution myth, or it's later commentators who are actually reading that into the Quran. And if it's at the level of the Quran, it's a problem for the Quran. If it's not, if the Quran isn't promoting that, just later commentators promoted it, then it's just not a problem for the Quran. At best, you could say it's a problem because the Quran might be ambiguous or confusing, using confusing language, but that's not the same as denying a historical fact or calling Allah a deceiver who even leads prophets astray. So it would be more. You can't say too much about a book allowing multiple interpretations. There are obviously tons of Bible passages that are open to all kinds of interpretations. So that would be my response to that question. I don't know if this would be kind of a different topic. I don't know if I should stop right now, but yeah, I do have a follow-up question, but I can hold off on that.
Yeah, let's give a chance for Dr. Andani to come back and respond to some of those things.
Yeah, so I mean, there's not much there's not much I disagree with. I think I heard you say that in principle, there's nothing wrong with God deceiving people for some valid reason, right? Um, so I think that, and we do find that in the Bible, as you said. So the issue then is not with substitution, is not God doing a deception per se. I think your issue with substitution was the fact that believers in Jesus were also deceived, right? They also came to a mistaken belief on substitution. So again, I don't believe in substitution, but if I were to put myself in the shoes of someone who does, the response to your concern would probably be something like this: that God is justified in deceiving the enemies of Jesus to save Jesus' life. And the fact, if that is the disciples of Jesus, who, by the way, ran away, they were not even there, right? They were not there for the crucifixion. If Jesus' disciples, due to Jesus' enemies being deceived, were also came to the mistaken conclusion, that is just a collateral confusion, and their reaching a false belief on this matter doesn't really harm them in any way, and that God is justified in allowing a collateral confusion if it serves the primary purpose of saving Jesus' life. Again, this is probably a response that the substitutionist would give, and I'm just trying to sort of be in their shoes like that. Just like, if someone was coming, the old Kantian problem, someone is coming to kill your neighbor. The Nazis are coming to kill your neighbor, so you lie to the Nazis and you say that the neighbor is not here, and then maybe the entire neighborhood thinks the neighbor is also not there, right? So that's like a collateral confusion, but one could argue that the collateral confusion is justified because the primary objective of protecting the person was achieved. So I think a substitutionist would probably argue along those particular lines. But really, I mean, I think like anyone could go back and forth on this, and I don't want to prolong pretending to play the substitutionist. So that's why I say that, uh, I'm not a substitutionist. And going to the other issue that you mentioned, so I think we could agree then that the Quran taken as is, like the Quran read by itself without tafsir or something, does not necessarily teach the substitution theory, nor does it necessarily teach that Jesus was not crucified. Maybe we have an agreement on that. So there's no necessary entailment between the words of the Quran and the proposition that Jesus Christ was not crucified on the cross. There's no necessary entailment.
Oh, is that back to me?
Yeah, you guys feel free to just kind of go back and forth at this
Okay,
point.
jump in. Okay, jump in. Okay, all right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, we can make more conversational then. All right. Yes. So yeah, I'm basically back in the day. In fact, let me give all you viewers out there. They're kind of people can have sort of competing goals. And so it's kind of two David Woods here. It's David Wood, the critic of Islam. David Wood, the critic of Islam, loves having this issue to point out in the Quran, to say, hey, here's a problem with the Quran. David Wood, the more evangelistic type. Well, I also like common ground for different reasons. Like, Muslims and Christians, we agree on a ton of things. So we agree that God created the universe and that God has sent prophets, and that Jesus was born of a virgin and performed miracles and so on. So we don't have to disagree on absolutely everything. So yeah, just that there is this tendency to want to be focusing on the critical, pointing out criticisms of the Quran, but and then when you of course hear from every Muslim you ever meet for a long time, either substitution theory or the theistic swoon theory, then you start, when you go to the Quran, that's just what you're thinking of it. That's all you think of when you see those verses. But yes, after reading some competing Muslim interpretations of that passage and seeing how different groups have taken different positions, and then just kind of forcing myself, what does this actually say? Does this mean this? And then, looking at other passages and so on in the Quran, I'm kind of like, I don't know, 60-40 on whether the Quran is not denying it versus whether it's denying it. So now I kind of lean towards the Quran is not denying that. So I don't think that is actually a problem for the Quran without adding some later interpretation. And so that would be my perspective on that. And then on the issue of the collateral confusion, with that issue, it's, if you're talking about Allah rescuing Jesus, and I don't even know what to take seriously in the tafsirs about this, because as you know, they're all over the place. Allah raises Jesus up through a roof or something like that. But if we're talking about Allah rescuing Jesus, I really don't see the need for anything that happened after that. Like, if Allah rescues Jesus, Jesus is safe. And so the idea that the collateral fallout, the collateral misunderstanding is 2,000 years of people not understanding it. And even Jesus' followers starting a religion that's centered on this crucifixion. And then Allah not correcting the mistake until Muhammad comes along. And then even when he corrects it, it's in a very confusing fashion where we can't even tell that that's what is being said. And so Allah's not really correcting the mistake until the level of the tafsir, which are completely inconsistent and contradict each other all over the place. All of that just sounds weird. Like, again, you and I agree, if God tricked someone to accomplish, some important goal, then we wouldn't have a problem with it. The problem is here's Allah tricking someone into believing that Jesus died by crucifixion when he didn't. The disciples, and then literally billions of Christians over this, and not just billions of Christians, every historical Jesus scholars across the board, and then even some Muslims were all misled by that. And then the correction is pretty unclear. It doesn't seem like that's all just to rescue Jesus, when Allah wouldn't need to do any of that. He had already rescued Jesus, so you didn't need all of the rest of this. So anyway, the point is, I know this isn't even your view. I'm just sort of defending. Like, I find this really distasteful view. I find it like insulting to God. And so again, this isn't just me. I mean, Sheikh Imran Hossein calls it pathetic nonsense, and he's actually in a situation where he's only talking to Muslims. He's warning Muslims, saying, are you actually going to stand before Allah and say, hey, Allah, you took someone else who didn't do what Jesus was accused of and had this other person disguised him? So are you actually going to stand before Allah and say that? And I'm sitting there watching that going, I agree. But then I look at the responses from Muslims, and they're saying things like, if he's denying what the Quran so clearly says, then he's not even a Muslim. It's like, you pointed out, you don't have to agree with the interpretation, with the most common interpretation. But anyway, it is really concerning to me that there are a lot of Muslims who aren't willing to consider any alternative explanation here, or they'll even start calling people non-Muslims for rejecting the standard Islamic narrative. And so I'm just really, the situation is, I wonder why, like, that's the only verse in the Quran that you aren't allowed to interpret in light of other things the Quran says. Like, any other place you go, if you go to fight those who do not believe, Muslims will want to say, well, you got to look at the surrounding context, and you got to look at the other verses in the Quran, and you have to look at the historical context. Notice, fight those who do not believe, if you ignore everything else, is a perfectly clear statement. But people understand, hey, you have to interpret these things in light of other Quran verses and history and so on. Except when we get to 4:157, and then no, you can't go to 3:169, you can't go to 5:117, you can't go to any of these passages. You just have to go with what it sounds like it's saying. And so anyway, it's just I'm wondered why I wonder why, and maybe this I would ask you why you think Muslims are so entrenched on this view. I mean, you pointed out, there's this you associate it with Sunni triumphalism, and then going along that route, I can see it. Like if you have this triumphalist mindset, then you want Allah to crush the people who are trying to get Jesus and they don't get Jesus at all. And maybe I could see maybe that's why among Shias there was this alternative position. If you're Shias who are often persecuted, then you wouldn't have as much problem with a prophet being horribly abused or even crucified. Then there's the issue of why the Twelvers sided with the Sunnis. I think that might be because there's a good parallel with the hidden imam. But yeah, so what are your thoughts on that, on people being just completely glued to a particular interpretation of one verse when for almost any other verse they would be completely open to interpreting it in light of other concerns?
Well, I think today what has happened, like any religious tradition, opinions are formed many centuries ago, and opinions just get repeated. So, in any religious tradition, if you go back and you revise a long-standing interpretation, you're just going to face some natural barriers. So, as I said, when you look at the post-classical tafsir after 1200, a lot of them are just repeating what the classical tafsir says about substitution. And a lot of this is just like, I don't want to say copy paste, but just like relating the same story over and over. And less people over time question a narrative. And this is true in all religions, it's even more true in other religions, including Islam, for long established religious doctrines, such as whether it's the Trinity or the uncreated speech of God in Sunni theology, whatever these things are. These theological narratives, they just have staying power once they've been solidified at a certain point in time. But it seems to me that since we both don't believe in the substitution theory for overlapping different reasons, so this is why you've probably seen me, and I think we have some agreement here that I don't think that this is a legitimate apologetic argument against Islam or against the Quran. At best, it's an apologetic argument against a certain tafsir tradition. So if we have a sort of concord, right, where you're talking to Muslims, and again, the view that I'm saying that Jesus was crucified, right? Uh, this is not a modern invented view, right? We find this view in the classical period, and it goes beyond that. If you read Ismaili texts, and I come from the Ismaili tradition, not only do we affirm the crucifixion, we think it's quite important. We have literature where we do a philosophical exegesis of the structure of the cross, for example. So, uh, just as Christians revere the cross for their own theological reasons, Ismailis have recognized the legitimacy of the symbolism of the cross, and Ismailis have Islamized the cross. So in a sense, Jesus being put on the cross, attached to the cross, in some way parallels the double shahada that you have in Islam. So the question, I think, the going forward question would be, what we should now talk about if we agree that Jesus was crucified, and that he died on the cross, and that the Quran doesn't deny it. There are other things to discuss, right? Because simply accepting that, and I mentioned it at the beginning, simply accepting that Jesus was crucified on the cross, right, and that he died, Muslims in principle can accept that. Whether you're Ismaili or Shia or Sunni, Sunnis can accept it. You've quoted Imran Hussein, who accepts it. So obviously that data point alone does not lead one to Christianity over Islam or vice versa. So there are other issues to be talked about, right? Like, what happened on the cross exactly? What is the significance of this crucifixion? Because there are different theologies of Jesus' death that you'll find, and you can talk about what your Christian theological interpretation of the death of Jesus is. I can tell you that in the Ismaili tradition, and I would argue the Quranic view, and I think you can also find this view in the New Testament as one of the theologies of Jesus dying, is that Jesus' death is the death of the righteous prophet martyr, whose suffering is a moral example that alerts people to the fact that the just one of God, the righteous one of God, was treated unjustly and that he spoke the truth. This is a theology of redemptive suffering, not vicarious atonement, but redemptive suffering, right? Which is perfectly acceptable to Muslims. It's the theology of the suffering of the righteous martyr, whose immense suffering alerts and awakens and sort of shakes all these other people who don't initially believe in him to realize that they have also committed wrongdoing, and it prompts people to seek forgiveness of sins and repent. This type of theology of the righteous servant of God who dies, this is accepted in the Shi'i tradition of Islam specifically. We have a parallel to this, which is the death and suffering of Imam Hussein, the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad, the the second or the third Shi'i Imam. Him and his family suffered as well at Karbala, and to this day, Twelver Shia Muslims and Ismaili Shia Muslims, they recognize what happened here, and there is a belief which is enacted ritually by Twelver Shias, especially, where you reenact the suffering of Imam Hussein to become more aware and more conscious of your own unrighteousness and your own sins. And by recognizing what Imam Hussein did and what he endured, spiritually, Imam Hussein intercedes for you, for your salvation and for your reception of God's blessings and mercy. So that's how I would approach, as a Muslim in the Shia tradition, that's how I would approach the death and suffering of Jesus. Like, to me, it still has that redemptive value. And of course, that doesn't mean I have to become Christian or anything. So my question to you then, and maybe the viewers know, but as a Christian, and by the way, I don't know what type of Christian you are. I don't know whether you're Catholic or Orthodox or Protestant, so maybe you can say that. But what is your theology of the cross?
Yeah. So you pointed out that. Oh, by the way, I don't really consider myself anything particular, but that would kind of make me a Protestant by default, right? Like, people say, I'm just a Christian. They usually they would usually be put in the Protestant category. But yeah, I don't. I'm sort of a kind of a mere Christianity type guy. But you mentioned, since we're not disagreeing on the crucifixion, then we should move on to our understanding of what it was about and what it means and so on. I totally agree. I think that is a cool area for discussion. But before I move on to give you my understanding, I just wanted to make sure, before we leave whether the Quran is affirming or denying the crucifixion of Jesus, before we move on, I just wanted to make sure, because some of this is going to be new, especially for Christians, but also for Muslims, understanding Surah 4, verse 157, in light of certain other things that the Quran has said. So before we can move on, could we just go through a couple of those verses? I want to make sure they have the verses and they understand how we're connecting those verses to 4:157. Could we just go through a couple of verses real quick? I just want to make sure before we move on that everyone at least understands.
Absolutely.
At least understands. Okay, so I'll just read a couple of verses here, and then, matter of fact, I'll read the verse and you can explain the relevant. Even though you've already done it to some extent in your opening. So 355. There's 355, 5117, both of which, I mean, 5117 clearly says Jesus died. I think people who believe in substitution theory can get around that by saying that it refers to Jesus, after he returns and then dies. And so this is after all of that. But 355 is definitely referring to Allah taking Jesus what would be the first time. And so the reason I would see for connecting 355 to 4157, you pointed out that the word that the term usually translated as "I will gather you," or here's the Shakir. He says, "I'm going to terminate the period of your stay on earth." I think the Oxford edition says, "God's going to take your soul." So you have all these different translations, but you've pointed out that ordinarily that refers to death. And so how I see it is, if you go to 4157 first and interpret it in light of substitution theory, and then you go to 355, you say, well, it can't mean he died. And therefore, I have to translate this. I have to interpret this some other way. But it seems like if you went to 355 first and said, oh, okay, this is language that's normally used to someone dying, and then went back to 4157, then you might say, well, maybe I need to interpret 4157 in light of these other Quran verses that sound as if Jesus is dying. Is that about right?
Yes. So what we tend to do in the academic field of Quranic studies, and there's also a traditional Muslim method, tafsir al-Quran bil Quran, right? Commenting on the Quran through other parts of the Quran. So this is a method that you find in both academia and in traditional Muslim tafsir. It's just not used consistently in tafsir, right? They'll do tafsir al-Quran bil Quran on certain verses, but they don't do it holistically. But if we follow that holistically, what we will find is that, yes, in Surah 355, in a conversation between God and Jesus, God tells Jesus, Inni mutawafika. So what that means is, verily, God says, verily, I am the one who takes you. That's what it literally means. Okay? So this is in Arabic the agentive form of the verb tawafa. And tawafa throughout the Quran is something that God does, or the angels do, or the angel of death does when taking souls. Okay, and I had a slide on this showing a little bit of the concordance on this, but this is like, it's well known. Okay, so in almost every instance of the verb tawafa, where God is doing it, angels are doing it, the angel of death are doing it, in almost every instant, or possibly every instant, I'll have to double check, a soul is taken from a body when death happens. So therefore, in 355, which I cited on my slide, the order is very important. So in 355, God said, Jesus, I will cause you to die and raise you to me. So notice the sequence in 355. God causes Jesus to die, or God takes Jesus, and then God exalts, raises Jesus. Notice the order. In the crucifixion verse, right, there's the denial that the Jewish enemies killed Jesus, and that denial is followed by God raised Jesus to himself. Okay?
Yeah,
so notice the order there.
Yeah, and I would say, like, if you want to interpret 355 as Allah, taking Jesus, then it doesn't sound like that, because then he says he's going to raise you. He's going to raise you. Whereas if you're interpreting this as Allah taking him, then it's like, I'll raise you and I'll raise you. Whereas, understanding in the light of, I'm going to cause you to die and then raise you, that does fit a lot better. But even that first part where you pointed out that Allah is saying, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do this, even that would be a reason, even that would be a basis for understanding 4157. If Allah is saying, hey, I'm doing this, I'm the one causing you to die, and a Jewish group is saying, haha, we got you, we killed you, then Allah, no, you didn't. I took him. And that, of course, ties in to 8:17, where Allah says, if you kill someone in battle, it's not you doing it, it's Allah doing it. And you'd say, what are you talking about? I'm the one that's standing in front of the guy. I'm the one who put my sword into him. What are you talking about? And Allah said, no, it's like you're an instrument to achieve Allah's to carry out Allah's plans, Allah's intentions, Allah's goals. And so understanding it in light of going to 4:157 in light of that, then it's, haha, we did this, but wait a minute. Allah says, stop saying you did stuff that Allah is actually kind of doing through you to achieve some purpose. And so you have those, and then of course you have this passage about, and this is what Sheikh Imran Hussein brought up. You have these verses about Allah taking the soul, and so he says Allah takes the souls at the time of their death, and those that die not during their sleep. Then he withholds those on whom he has passed the decree of death. So Allah takes a soul, and then he has the option of returning it. He can return it. If he hasn't, marked you for death, he can return your soul, in which case you go on living. And so Sheikh Imran Hussein looks at this and says, okay, so, Jesus on the cross, Allah takes his soul. He would have been dead to the onlookers and so on, but later he restores the soul. And so he was alive. What's the problem? Anyway, the point of all that was just, I just wanted to make sure people understood, because if you are really, and I'm saying this from experience, when I would hear 15 years ago someone offer some alternative explanation, it seemed like it's a cop out. You're trying to avoid what the Quran is actually saying. When after a long time of actually reading the verses, then it starts to look like, no, I get the point. I get the point of what it's saying. So I just want people to understand that this isn't a cop out. This isn't some weird thing where you're an academic, so you can't deny the crucifixion. There are multiple Quranic ways to interpret that verse that does not involve substitution theory. And so it's just a matter of understanding the kind of language the Quran uses about various things. Anyway,
It's also worth noting. I know you're not saying this, but if somebody said, "Oh no, this is a cop out," you're just revising what the Quran says. Some people still say that. So okay, you can try to accuse a Muslim of a cop out, but now are you going to tell me that Jeffrey Parinder, Todd Lawson, Gabriel Said Reynolds, and Juan Cole, neither of whom is Muslim, they all reach the same conclusion that I've presented today? So why are the academics, historians copping out now, right? It doesn't make any sense. Like, is there now did Muslim apologists take over academia and pay all these people to come to the same conclusion that the Quran, actually does not deny the crucifixion? There's even more names. I mean, I just read a Christian scholar at a Christian college who made the same argument. I think what's going on here, and this is a point I hope our Christian viewers take heed. So it is unfortunate that many Christian apologists, debaters, they approach Islam and the Quran as something preaching like the complete contrary or the complete contradictory of what Christians believe. And that involves approaching Muslims, Islam as a faith tradition, and the Quran as wholly other. But this, if what I've proposed today is correct, and I believe it is correct, there are times when the Quran is defending Jesus against certain, not all, certain Jewish polemic. Because why did the Talmud claim that Jesus was tried by the rabbinical authorities and then stoned and then hung on Passover? Why did they say that? They created a counter narrative to argue that Jesus is not the Messiah, as we would expect polemical literature to do. So when the Quran says these certain, rebellious Israelites, when the Quran says they did not kill him and crucify him, and when the Quran calls them out for insulting the Virgin Mary, which they did in the Talmud, the Quran is defending figures that Christians also love. And you'll find this in other places, that there are other places in the Quran where you think the Quran is criticizing Christianity as such or a Christian belief. And sometimes it is, okay? But sometimes the Quran is actually criticizing a position that actually many Christians would also reject as heresy or something like that. So I would ask people, without denying that there are serious differences between these two religions, but I would say that it's more productive to approach the Quran as a dialogue partner instead of an enemy. And on this issue of crucifixion, and there are other issues that we can talk about, but on this issue of crucifixion, you have to look at the Quran as a companion a companion text to the New Testament. That is a dialoguing with both the New Testament and the Talmud. You should not look at the Quran as an enemy text. And that doesn't mean now you have to believe in the Quran or you become a Muslim. No, it just means that not every position that doesn't match yours is an enemy position. Sometimes you can have a friendly position that's still an alternative, and that can lead to constructive exchange between the positions.
And that's kind of a as far as why Muslims eventually settled on substitution theory as the main theory. What you just pointed out about, Jews putting together a counter narrative. You see this all through history. If Christians can come up with a position in response to someone they're disagreeing with, and Jews can do the same, and Muslims can do the same. But early on, it's basically there are times when different groups will emphasize the common ground, and there are other times when they want to emphasize the differences in order to keep the community separate and to help people in their community say, hey, whatever you do, avoid that group because of this, and they want to emphasize the disagreement. Anyway, I mean, I think that's a possible explanation for why substitution theory became the dominant position, is it was the one that sort of split people up most. And I'm sure John of Damascus is our first record of this. And so the Christians also wanted to emphasize the difference in saying, hey, be careful of that over there because it says this about Jesus. It says God replaced him and so on. Now I saw Cameron go back to the screen. Cameron, were you wanting to go on to Q&A, or should I? He did ask me a question about sort of my view of the crucifixion and so on. So I don't know if you want to go into Q&A or want me to.
I was gonna say that we do have Q&A in just a little bit, and I did have a question for Dr. Andani, but I can hold that for a little bit later if you want to answer his question.
Yeah, so you have different theories of atonement, substitution, things like that. I usually don't feel a need to specify one position if in other words, I think that something can accomplish multiple purposes and multiple goals all at once, and can fulfill various prophecies and so on. But overall, I tend to see the crucifixion in light of a story that's unfolding all the way from Genesis, and the clearest beginning to that is with Abraham and Isaac. And, a modern person looking at that story saying, wait, God commanded Abraham to sacrifice his son. What is this? What sort of barbaric nonsense is this? But if you look at it, I see all of this as ultimately fulfilled in the crucifixion of Jesus. So what starts off is, Abraham's in a pagan environment, and back in the ancient world, your love and devotion for your God is kind of measured by the value of your sacrifice. And that's why, the more valuable your sacrifice, the greater your devotion to God, and the better your odds of getting your God to send rain or something like this. Is various places in the world you end up with child sacrifice, the greatest thing you could ever do. Your most beloved gift that you could bring to the altar would be your son or your daughter for sacrifice. And so God commands Abraham, hey, do that. Abraham's totally willing to do it. He's ready to do it. And then it says the angel of the Lord steps in and says, hey, stop that. And Abraham, of course, had already said that God's going to provide his own sacrifice. And he says that God's going to provide a lamb. But then the angel of the Lord steps in and says, stop doing that. I'm going to bless all nations of the world through you. And it's through this particular offspring, through Isaac. And then the angel of the Lord stops it, but then provides a ram. And so the question is, what happens to this lamb that Abraham talked about? And so you have this angel of the Lord. What's interesting is the angel of the Lord is viewed in Christian theology as the pre-incarnate Christ. So the pre-incarnate Christ is there when Abraham says God's going to provide a lamb, and it's the pre-incarnate Christ that stops the practice. So fast forward, and you have prophecies. You have Isaiah 53 and passages about someone being pierced for our transgressions. But then you get to the New Testament. Jesus comes along in the Gospel of John. John the Baptist says, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." And John says, "I bear witness that this is the Son of God." And then you get to the most famous Bible verse there is, John 3:16, which it stands on its own. And that's why people hold it up at ball games and so on. But God so loved the world that he gave his one and only son, or that he gave his only begotten son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have everlasting life. So I read this in the context all the way going back to the story of Abraham and Isaac, that I view it as one massive like judo flip of paganism, where the ancient pagans are trying to show their love for their God by sacrificing their son to show their God how much they love him. And it's like God in the New Testament says, hey, this isn't how this works. You don't sacrifice your son to show me how much you love me. I sacrifice my son to show you how much I love you. And so I just regard it as like completely flipping the script on all of this. There are all sorts of Christian doctrines and so on that are tied to that, but and this is why I find it. You mentioned Ismaili interpretations of the crucifixion. This is why I find them interesting, because it's like they're always looking for some. You got the surface level, and then you've got a deeper level. And it seems like the Ismailis are always looking for some deeper level of meaning in all of this. So I look at it, a crucifixion, that's the fact of history. And then there's how you understand it. And so on a deeper level, it just appears to me as part of this, part of a divine plan all along. And anyway, I just find it interesting how it all ties together. But yes, I look at the crucifixion in light of something that starts all the way back in Genesis and then continues on till now.
Should I respond, Cameron, or did you want to move to something else?
Yeah, let me go ahead and ask the question that I've got. As I was listening to your opening statement, and I really appreciated it, and I just had a question about it. So the idea is basically that the they in Surah 4:157 is referring to the Jews. I have that part right. Is that correct?
Yeah, I mean, not all Jews, but you could say a certain subsection of Jews who were involved in this anti-Jesus, anti-Mary polemic, which we find attested in the Talmud.
Yeah, so the question I've got is related. This is purely just clarifying. I'm curious what your view on this is. So the part where it says it was made to appear that way to them, what is that all about?
Well, it's basically saying that the way things unfolded, like historically, on Earth, the Jewish enemies of Jesus concluded, right, that they did in fact kill him and crucify him, and in their mind, they did it to prove he's not the real Messiah, right? So they're sort of allowed to believe from what happened physically that we the enemies of Jesus, we killed him, we crucified him. So it appeared, the affair of the crucifixion, it appeared to them that they had agency, and that they had power over life and death, and that they disproved Jesus' messianic status. The Quran is countering this, and the Quran is saying, no, they did not kill him, they did not crucify him. God exalted him. So this is sort of like the Quran is voicing a vindication of Jesus, as the true Messiah and prophet of the children of Israel. And that's why I mentioned that it's better that Christians see the Quran as a companion text. Like the Quran on this
Hmm.
issue, the Quran is on the same side as Christians on this particular issue. Obviously, not every issue, but on this issue. And you have to see it as an alternative but friendly take on the crucifixion. Not what I've been hearing. Just yesterday on Twitter, William Lane Craig tweeted out an old video of his called "The Achilles Heel of Islam." And he makes this argument and portrays the Quran as completely opposite of history and Christian belief on the issue of crucifixion. No, that this is completely wrong. And I would expect people like William Lane Craig, and I hope viewers today, and from what I hear, David probably agrees with me, that this particular point, that the Quran opposes the fact of the crucifixion, and therefore it should be discarded, this is just not a valid point. There are much more important issues to talk about, and maybe we can do it in the future, such as the Trinity, the Incarnation, the Atonement. These are where we have real disagreements on, and we can have a civilized discussion and debate about those points. But all this polemical time being wasted on people trying to make the Quran say what they want the Quran to say just to score points, to me, I find it utterly pointless. And that's why I'm really glad, Cameron and David, that you all agreed to this discussion today, because I think we've made some real headway.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
follow.
Cam, you. Oh, sorry. I just want to point out, Cam. I mean, you zeroed in on the core issue is basically what does that mean that it was made to appear to them, and so that's where substitution theory is inserted. It was made to appear to them by Allah disguising someone else, making him look like Jesus, and then this other person is crucified in Jesus' place. That's where that gets inserted. But as we've been discussing, that's not what it actually says, and so yeah, I understand why you get the impression of that, especially if you've heard that all your life. But as Khalil's pointed out, if the and Christians could agree with this. If people are boasting, ha ha ha, we exposed Jesus, we overpowered him, we killed him, we won, and Allah is saying, no, you didn't. It just looked that way to you. It appeared that way to you. It seems like a really simple interpretation. I mean, it seems like a really simple point to be made. You thought you got the victory over Jesus. It appeared to you as if you did. You thought you had the victory because you crucified him and killed him, but you actually didn't because Allah took unto himself, and you were mere instruments in Allah's hands. I don't. It seems far less confusing than packing in a bunch of stuff about substitution theory and so on.
So one of my concerns is that this interpretation of this verse is almost and I'm really just curious what your thoughts are on this. Is that it kind of seems anti-Semitic in the sense of like it's painting the Jews, at least during the time, at least a portion of the time, as like proud murderers. Like they're proud of this fact that they put Jesus to death. That's what they thought. Obviously, this is this interpretation. They thought, but they were proud of this, and they were kind of going around telling people this, and that kind of makes the Jews to be out these. It paints this picture of these again these sort of proud and boasting murderers, and so I worry that's just a sort of again an initial like worry concern. Kind of just curious to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Well, let's be clear that the New Testament overall portrays the Jews as having like almost all responsibility for the death of Jesus, and Peter in his speech in Acts says to the Israelites, like it says, "Oh Israelites," and then it says, you killed him. So you have there are polemical passages in the New Testament that I would argue are far worse than this, but the Quran is not making an accusation on all Jews. Okay, the Quran, when you read the Quran in context, it's talking about a specific group of people at the time of Prophet Muhammad who came to him and said, "Bring us a book from heaven." So there were certain Jewish tribes who lived at the time of Prophet Muhammad, and Muhammad had a pact with all the Jewish tribes in Medina, but about three of the Jewish tribes, they had internal issues, and A subset of them, they tell the prophet, bring down a book from heaven. And then the Quran responds to that group and says, well, they ask you this, but they asked Moses something even greater than this. And then it goes on to list a bunch of things that not all Jews, but the Jews historically who were not faithful to their covenant with God. And the Hebrew Bible is all over, has tons of examples of this. So I mentioned in my opening, if you go to your Bible right now and read Nehemiah chapter 9, in Nehemiah chapter 9, the Levites utter a very long prayer. And in that prayer, the Levite, Jews, Israelites, they basically list off a whole bunch of ways that they were not faithful to their covenant with God and so on. So, no, this is not anti Semitic. Remember, the Talmud makes the claim, right? If you recall, I showed you two passages from the Talmud. So the Quran is responding to the Talmud. And according to modern historians like Juan Cole and others, the views of the Talmud is actually the closest views that would have been circulating at that time in Arabia. And Juan Cole, who's a historian, he's also written an article on the same topic. And it turns out that the this Jewish polemic against Jesus and Mary, it was also being promoted by Khusro, the Shah of the Persian Sasanian Empire. So there was a debate going on between the Byzantine Heraclius and the Sasanian Shah Khusro, and the Christians at that time accused the Sasanians of blaspheming and speaking against Jesus and Mary. In fact, Khusro, according to a Christian historian at the time, Khusro reportedly told the head of the Byzantine Empire, he said something along the lines of, Jesus was not able to save himself against the Jews, so why do you think he's going to be able to save you and your empire against me? So this polemical tit for tat is already going on in the set. This is a contemporary with the Quran. So the Quran is entering into a debate that's already been going on between Jews and Christians and Sasanians, and the Quran has picked a side in the debate. It has picked the side of defending the honor of Mary and the messiahship of Jesus. And according to Juan Cole's published article, that's also part of the context. So no, this is not anti-Semitism. It's just like if you go read speeches during World War II, speeches from Allied leaders like Winston Churchill or Roosevelt, in their speeches, which are made in the midst of war and all this stuff going on, you'll find them just use shorthand terms like the Germans or the Japanese. Now, they're not talking about all Germans, and they're not talking about all Japanese, right? They're specifically talking about those groups of people who are committing war and this sort of thing. But the language out of context can appear very general. So the same thing is also going on here. We have to situate both the Quran and the New Testament in their original context. We have to read the labels and the language and the names of groups as who is it referring to at that time, at that place. And then it becomes very clear that in reality, this is not racism or anti-Semitism.
I just wanted to mostly agree with Khalil on that. So I think the difference in perspective is like throughout the Old Testament, you have condemnations of Jews who keep sort of reverting to idolatry and wanting to be like the other nations and so on. You see the Jews, God's constantly saying, I'm going to destroy you guys for this. We generally don't say, well, that's anti-Semitic for criticizing the Jews for what they were doing. And then in the New Testament, it's a little different, but the New Testament authors are Jewish, and so it basically, when they're pointing to their fellow Jews and saying, "Hey, you guys are wrong," and so it has a more of a vibe of an internal critique, although not as much as the Old Testament. And then so by the time you get to Islam, it's more of an external critique. But I would just agree with Khalil. There have been, just keep in mind, there have been Christians who've said horrible things about Jews. There have been Jews who've said horrible things about Christians and Muslims. There have been Muslims who've said horrible things about Jews and Christians and so on. And so, can you correct people when they say something like that? And one impression you get from the Quran is, especially in that passage, it's telling Jews, stop picking and choosing which prophets you're going to agree with. You have to agree with all of them. And it's sort of saying, hey, Jesus is supposed to be it's supposed to be on the list of people that you believe. In fact, right after the crucifixion section, it says that all Jews are going to believe in Jesus at some point. And so there's that. Now, to be fair, I do have other concerns, like Surah 582, which if you read as a blanket statement about Jews, it says they're the most vehement in hostility towards the believers and so on. But I'm sure Khalil would think that that's applying to certain enemies of Muhammad. And then in the Sunni traditions, of course, then you have like these end times prophecies, like the end's not going to come until you fight the Jews and so on. And so, yeah, you do, I think, end up with problems there. But as far as this passage saying there were Jews who were saying bad things about Jesus, and then the Quran is actually responding to those claims, yeah, I don't take that as anti-Semitic.
So I think we should also remember contextually, at least in the case of the Quran, the Prophet Muhammad formed an alliance pact with various Jewish tribes. It's called the Constitution of Medina. This is one of the early documents that we have from the life of Muhammad, including the Quran. And if you read the Constitution of Medina, you could just find it sitting around online. It says several times that the Jews are an ummah along with the believers. So the Jews in that time were members of this community. And the Quran in 2 verses explicitly says that Jews can be saved. A lot of Christians don't know this, but in Surah 2, verse 62, and finally later in Surah 5, verse 69, the Quran says, those who believe, that's referring to the followers of Muhammad, and those who are Jews, and those who are Christians, and sometimes it says those who are Sabians, anyone who has faith in God and the last day and does virtuous deeds, on them there will be no fear and they will have nothing to grieve. And that last expression, there will be no fear and no grief on them, this is a common expression in the Quran to talk about those who go to paradise. So in the very last surah of the Quran, Surah 5, verse 69, it explicitly says that Jews and Christians, alongside those who believe and follow Muhammad, that all 3 of these groups are eligible for salvation. So you don't have this Quranic sort of diatribe that's anti-Jewish or anti-Christian. The Quran's view is actually quite inclusive. So when we read the crucifixion verses or any other verses, we have to keep in mind all of the Quranic data. We cannot read the Quran in an atomized way, just like I'm sure Cameron and David would say, you can't read the Bible in an atomized way by saying this, we'll go by this verse and we'll ignore, 10 other verses.
I just want to very quickly just agree with.
While you're saying that, I'm going to go ahead and put the first question on the screen.
Yeah, no problem. I just wanted, because I do have all sorts of concerns about various things that the Quran says, but there are passages along the lines, very important passages along the lines of what Khalil was just pointing out, and one interesting passage is Surah 5, verse 43 to Surah 5, verse 48, where some Jews come to Muhammad to settle dispute, and Allah says, why are they coming to you when they have the Torah? And then a few verses later, it tells Christians to judge by the gospel. And then 548, it tells Muslims, of course, follow Muhammad and judge by the Quran. But at the end of that verse, it says that Allah actually wants these different religious communities so that they compete with each other in good works. So as far as, you get to Surah 5, hey, Allah is fine with different religious communities. Now, so I have serious concerns about whether that's the final takeaway message of the Quran. But the point is, yes, you do find these things in the Quran. So all
right, yeah, let's move on to some Q&A. We've only got about another, say, 15 minutes with Khalil. So we'll get through as many of these questions as we can. So this one is about Acts 3:15. It says, Acts 3:15 has Peter saying Jews killed Jesus. Let me go ahead and just read that verse here. Verse 15, and you killed the author of life, whom God raised from the dead. To this we are witnesses. And in verse 12, it shows us who he's actually referring to, men of Israel. And so Khalil even just mentioned that in his response to me just now, this verse. So any thoughts on that verse?
Oh, is this to me or for David? I don't know.
I believe it's for you, but we can get David's thoughts on it as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, we need to keep in mind the context here that firstly, this what Acts is doing is it's building a narrative, right, for a particular audience. So it's not a secret that a lot of the New Testament writings are written for a non-Jewish audience, right, and sometimes there's competing audiences. So I believe that Luke Acts together is crafting a certain narrative, and it uses blanket terms like Jews for narrative purposes. I don't think, and I'm not an expert, but I don't think the book of Acts itself is anti-Semitic, because one thing we need to remember, and according to James Dunn and others, the disciples of Jesus and the family of Jesus in the book of Acts are Jewish. They go to the temple, they keep the Sabbath, they pray in the synagogue, they keep all the Jewish dietary laws. The first followers of Jesus are Jewish. So I don't think the book of Acts itself can be anti-Semitic, but there's a narrative here, and this is the narrative I was talking about, and this is the narrative that the righteous servant or righteous prophet of God comes to the people and is rejected and killed, and most people don't believe in him. And after they've done this injustice to Jesus, the righteous servant of God, the people, in this case the Israelites, only after the injustice is done, they come to realize, oh, we really did something wrong here. And that realization then prompts them to believe in Jesus and reform their ways. I believe that is the narrative that we find in Peter's speech in Acts. So that's why I don't think it's anti-Semitic.
I'll just add that entire section. I mean, you can read the Quran in the same light. So you have that in verse 15, and then you go down to verse 18. Well, matter of fact, verse 17. Peter says, "And now, brothers, I know that you acted in ignorance, as did also your rulers. But what God foretold by the mouth of all the prophets, that his Christ would suffer, he thus fulfilled." And so it's saying, hey guys, we know you were doing this, and it's bad, but God was doing something through you. And so anyway, that you can read the Quran in that way. Hey, you guys were doing something, but God is actually doing something through you. So so repent of, in here it would be repent of what you did, and in the Quran it would be repent of your boasting and blasphemy, speaking against Mary and Jesus. But yeah, it's a similar idea in that God was doing something. Stop acting like you did something.
All right, moving on to the next question. This one's from Tifer Forshan. Should Muslims and Christians collaborate to counteract the dominance of secularism? And we'll let Khalil start on this one.
Yes, I think Muslims and Christians should collaborate, and I think they're already collaborating. We are just not. We don't talk about the collaborations that are already happening on YouTube, because they're happening in physical places. They're happening at university campuses. They're happening at food banks. They're happening at homeless shelters. Even the Vatican has various agreements and collaborations with various Muslim leaders and Muslim organizations to address things like ultra poverty, to address ethical issues. Because one of the problems with secularism, and I'm sure you all agree with me, is secularism as an ideology seems to have a number of shortcomings, especially the lack of an ethical vision that's coherent, that has objectivity, right? Secularism as an ideology also seems to have quality of life problems. I mean, we have a lot of survey data that people who are quote unquote religious, who attend places of worship regularly, they have longer marriages, they have more children, they have stronger families. and again, I'm talking about secularism. I'm not against the idea of a secular state, but secularism is a particular ideology. It's a package which comes with a worldview, certain views on ethics, and so on. And in reality, secularism has become a partner with materialism, this rampant desire to just acquire wealth without caring for the poor in society. Secularism has become a companion with certain Western tendencies to expand and overthrow other governments, and overthrow the will of people in other parts of the world, such as the Middle East, and other places. So I think Muslims and Christians can collaborate on secular against secularism. And that doesn't mean that you have to theologically agree. I think if we talk about ethics, if we talk about cosmopolitan ethics, and there are certain ethical principles that, regardless of our theologies, we agree on. We agree on the sanctity of life. We agree on the importance of a full family. We agree on the need for politics. Although politics should not be a theocracy, we agree on the need that certain ethics about spiritual life should still inform what is happening politically, and we can debate what those ethics are. So we agree that the sense of the sacred and the awareness of the sacred, whatever form it takes, is important, and it should be part of human society. So I think that collaboration is important.
And I'll just, I mean, from experience, it's actually how I started studying Islam. I mean, my best friend in college was a Muslim. Before that, I had a friend who was an imam, and had some exchanges with him, but wasn't really studying very much. But yeah, my best friend in college was a Muslim, and we ended up as best friends mainly because some of our other friends, when they had free time, wanted to go clubbing and stuff like that. We weren't interested, so we always just by default ended up hanging out with each other, and then got into discussions and so on. But we did have situations, like I remember we were walking through this. It was an event where all the campus organizations were having their tables and inviting people and so on. Anyway, we walked by this table that was handing out bumper stickers that said, "Don't don't pray in my school. I won't think in your church. I won't Don't pray in my school, and I won't think in your church." And we're walking by. I'm walking by with a Muslim. I wasn't going to say anything. I was going to walk on by. But my friend Nabil he stops and goes, "What do you mean by that?" And they got all nervous because it was obvious what was about to happen. They were going to say, people in churches don't think. And he was going to say, what about mosques? Right. It was obvious what was going to happen. They panicked and froze, and they just said, "Oh, we're just handing these out for someone else. We don't even know what they mean." And so it was an interesting situation where you had Christian and Muslim together. So there are definitely situations like that, and we can agree on things. I have a little problem with like forming official alliances, because then it would be like, well, you can't criticize this view over here because we have an alliance and we only agree to go after secularism or something, let's say. But I mean, at the end of the day, if I agree with someone, if it's a Muslim or an atheist or whatever, then I agree with you, and that's all there is to it. So it's just a situation where if Khalil and I were in a room with an atheist, then Khalil and I would agree that God created the world and so on. So we'd have agreements against the atheist. If the atheist rejects Muhammad, I agree with you. I reject Muhammad. If the question is whether Christianity is true or some specific Christian doctrine, then Khalil might agree with the atheist on that. But yeah, there are problems in society that all different groups can point out.
All right, let's move on to this. Maybe our last question for today. Gray is 174. Are there situations where we can be certain that Allah doesn't have some morally sufficient reason that we can't access to deceive people via Jesus? So I suppose let's get David to start on this one.
Are there situations where we can be certain? That certain's a strong word if you're talking philosophically. That Allah doesn't have some morally sufficient reason that we can't access to deceive people via Jesus. Yeah, and that is important, and that's why I normally say there's no apparent reason. So I think the point that he's getting at here is, I pointed out that I wouldn't have a problem with God tricking someone for some good reason or for some important reason, but I just don't see any reason with the substitution theory. In other words, it seems like all of the effects are bad. You can mention that Allah, rescued Jesus. That would be important, but I mean, after that, Jesus is safe. Jesus is with God. He doesn't need any more. He doesn't need any more protecting. All this other stuff, especially thousands of years of people getting it wrong, um, doesn't make sense from an Islamic perspective. Again, Jesus followers who are Muslims becoming convinced that Jesus died on the cross, and that causes them to reinterpret their theology, and then you get Christianity, and so you get this whole Christian concept for thousands of years, to the point where it's the biggest religion in history. And you look at it and you say, why? What was the point of all that? It looks like the overwhelming bulk of the consequences from an Islamic perspective are negative. And so why would Allah do that? And so I say there's no apparent reason. With that said, there could be. God can always have a reason that I'm not aware of. God could have a reason that I have no idea about, where again, this is assuming substitution theory is the correct interpretation. But yes, I will grant, if substitution were correct, God could have some reason that we have no idea about, and it could make sense of that. So for you defenders of substitution theory, you can say David Wood grants the possibility that God has some morally sufficient reason for all of it, but I can't imagine what it could possibly be.
There's actually a lot of overlap with that in your work on the problem of evil, which is what your dissertation was on.
Yeah.
The specific, one of those specific responses to the problem of evil is something called, it's a sort of academic term, skeptical theism.
Skeptical theism. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So there is a parallel between skeptical theism. Like if you want to say, hey, why is that deer in the woods suffering? Now, you might be inclined to say, well, because God made a world where biology works and so on, and it's actually good to, for organisms to have a pain sense to keep them from danger and so on. But if someone actually wanted to point out something, here's a situation where it's gratuitous evil, suffering that where there's a point is one thing. Suffering where there just seems to be no point. Like, why does this child in this children's hospital suffering horribly and then die after a week? There doesn't seem to be any great point to it. And so you have various theodicies that are offered, but at the end of the day, a skeptical theist would say, even if all these explanations fail, God knows so much that he can have all kinds of reasons for doing things that we have no clue about. So I am sympathetic to that. And so that's why, the same reason I would say, of course, God can have reasons for substitution theory that I don't know about. But again, doesn't look like it. So notice my response there might be, atheists might be going, aha, that's how I feel about evil. Like, I don't see it. I don't see any point, right?
I thought you were going to keep going. Were you going to tie that back?
I can keep going. Yeah. So anyway, you can always say God has reasons for this and that. It's sort of, if all you had to go on in this situation, if all you had to, like comparing evil with the substitution theory, if all you had to go on was just, it looks like there's pointless suffering, and you had no reasons to believe that in God or in Christianity or anything else, then I would probably side with the atheist. If all you had to go on was just there's tons of suffering, tons of pointless suffering, and nothing else to go on. But that's not all you have to go on. You have a ton of arguments and evidences for theism. And so the theist is looking at the saying, wait, I have all of these reasons and I have this problem. Well, which seems stronger to me? Well, the case for the existence of God seems stronger. Therefore, over here, even though I don't see reasons for a lot of the horrible things that go on, God could have reasons that I'm not aware of. When it comes to substitution theory, it's different. I see no reason for any of this, and I see no reason to think that it's true. I see no reason to think that substitution theory is true. So if you were a Muslim and you really thought that you have great evidence that substitution theory is correct, then in that position, you might want to say, okay, even if I can't think of any good reason for Allah to do it, then maybe he has a reason that I'm not aware of.
All right, let's get Khalil now to kind of share his thoughts, and then we'll close out the stream.
I think it might be better to just go to the next question if you want.
Okay. Well, if you'd like, we could do one more. I just wanted to be respectful of your time. I know you've got a sort of hard stop, and we're only 3 minutes away. Is that okay? Would you like to take another one?
Yeah, we can do one more. Sure.
Okay, sure. From Sentinel Apologetics, he says, "Is Khalil's argument exactly Acts 2:23 through 24?" Let me go ahead and read that really quickly. So this one said, well, let me start in 22. "Men of Israel, hear these words: Jesus of Nazareth, a man attested to you by God with mighty works and wonders and signs that God did through him in your midst, as you yourselves know." 23. "This Jesus delivered up according to the definite plan and foreknowledge of God, you crucified and killed by the hands of lawless men." 24. "God raised him up, loosing the pangs of death, because it was not possible for him to be held by it." So the question is, isn't this just basically what your argument is with respect to Surah 4:157?
Yeah, it's not that my argument is Acts. I'm saying that if you read the Quran in its context, as I demonstrated, you read the Quran intra-Quranically, right? Then what the Quran is telling us, that the enemies of Jesus claimed agency to kill him, and the Quran is denying that it was by their agency. The Quran is instead saying that it's by God's agency that Jesus died. Then my claim is that reading of the Quran matches what Peter says in Acts, right? Peter said that it's by God's preordained plan and foreknowledge that Jesus was handed over and killed by his enemies. So I'm trying to show that actually there is an agreement when the Quran is read properly. There is an agreement between what Peter says in Acts and what the Quran says, and we don't need to have this binary conflict over the issue of the crucifixion. And there's one more thing I want to add. Somebody wrote in the chat that, Khalil is an Ismaili and he only represents, some small percentage of Muslims. So look, everything I've argued today, right, has been argued on the basis of merit. I have intertextually and intratextually analyzed the Quran to make my argument. So me being Ismaili really has nothing to do with anything that I've said today. So I'm not saying, well, I'm Ismaili, the Ismailis said this, therefore that's the correct view. I've argued for the correct view using metrics, evidence, and arguments that are accessible to Muslims, non-Muslims, Ismailis, non-Ismailis. So I would say, look at what I'm saying and the basis for what I'm saying. I could be a Jew and I can make the same argument. I can be an atheist, I can make the same argument. And that's why I listed in my last slide about 4 or 5 academics of various backgrounds, none of whom is Ismaili, who come to the exact same conclusion on what the Quran is really saying that I have come to. So I think pointing out that someone comes from a minority denomination of Islam in any Muslim Christian discussion is not relevant when the point that they're arguing is not appealing to the authentic or the correctness of their tradition to make the claim.
Yeah, let me just add very quickly, Cameron, because Christians can do the exact same thing. See, you have different. Sometimes you have different authorities, and then sometimes you have a common authority. So if Khalil were saying, "Hey, Jesus was crucified because," let's say he came along and said, "The Aga Khan said it," and then a non-Ismaili, because I don't care what the Aga Khan says, I don't care about that. If he's saying, look closer at what the Quran said, the parallel would be like if a Catholic came to a Protestant and said, "Hey, look at what the Bible says," and the Protestant goes, "I don't have to listen to you. You're a Catholic." Well, the Catholic's pointing at the Bible, right? If the Catholic were to say, "The Pope says," and that was the only reason, then the Protestant could say, "I don't believe in the Pope." But if he's saying, "Hey, look at what the book we agree on actually says," that is not a time to say, you're from a different group. And so if a person from a different sect of Islam says, "Hey, why don't we take a closer look at what the Quran says to make sure that we've got the correct view of what the Quran is actually saying," the response, regardless of your background, should be, "Okay, well, yeah, I do want to make sure I'm right." And at the very least, even if you think Khalil is wrong, it should be, "Okay, yeah, let's take a close look at this to see, so I can show you you're wrong or something like that. But anyway, it's yeah, guys, enough of this. You're from a different group, therefore we have no common ground on anything.
Yeah, well, I've really enjoyed this conversation today. It was marketed as a debate, and it turned out to just be, I think, a very productive conversation. So I appreciate both of you guys taking the time to have this conversation. And Khalil, thank you so much for. Was it you or me? I think you suggested like coming on and doing something, and I said, would you be interested in having a conversation with David? And then it just kind of worked out. So I appreciate you kind of reaching out and suggesting this. So and also thank you for your time.
Yeah, thank you, Cameron. Thank you, David. I think that hopefully this could be the beginning of more dialogues. Sometimes the formal debate format is not very ideal, and I think the dialogue format is ideal. And the other thing is, I think what I suggested to you, Cameron, and I'm glad that you were receptive, is I just suggested that it might help to have academically trained Muslims to talk about these issues, because what academically trained Muslims are able to do is that although we have our own positions, right, we try to give an even-handed survey historically and theologically of different positions, and we acknowledge different positions within the Muslim tradition. And we don't just come and say, my way or the highway. And I think you can have more productive Muslim-Christian dialogues, even when we disagree, right? Like, we should not be allergic to theological disagreement. It's okay to disagree. It's okay to think the other guy's wrong. It's fine. What's important is, how do we express disagreement? Do we keep to the ethics of civility and human dignity and respect when we disagree? Or do we, call each other names? And as long as we can keep up the ethics of respect and harmony, I think these dialogues, especially when we disagree, are completely fine, and many people will learn. So if there's anything I would say to Cameron, is I hope this is just the beginning of more stuff like this. And if you're interested, I'm more than happy to participate again at some point.
Excellent. David, do you have any sort of closing thoughts before we end it?
Nope.
No? Awesome.
Nope.
Okay. All right. Well,
oh, no. I was just gonna say, yeah, I agree. And it is good to have academic Muslims give a perspective in addition to the reasons that Khalil gave. If you're a Christian online, and this is part of the problem that's being addressed here, if you are interacting with people online, or even if you're interacting with Muslim friends, you can start to think that what is being said is the only position, and that's how people come to think, this is the only thing the Quran could possibly saying. It's the only thing the Quran could possibly be saying right now, because that's all I've ever heard. And so it is good to get some different perspectives on people who are looking at things from a different angle, because then you find it forces you to look more closely and see, well, are people wrong about this?
Yeah. Well, as my last appeal, as we sort of close out the show today, I want to invite you guys, the audience, to share your thoughts on this conversation. Let me know in the comments what you think, and whether or not you were sort of convinced or not convinced. If you think that the view that Khalil shared is wrong, or if you think David is wrong, whatever, or if you think I'm wrong, like, share your thoughts in the comments. Let me know what you think. I'll try to do my best to read and respond to what I can. Thank you guys for tuning in. I'll see you in the next Capturing Christianity video. See you guys later. Hey, it's me again. Actually, don't leave yet. I've got something super, super important to tell you. So first of all, you're awesome. Like, you just watched a really, really long video just now, and you're still watching it. That is actually pretty amazing. Secondly, we have hundreds, literally hundreds of other apologetics related videos for you to watch on our channel. Go check them out. I've interviewed exorcists, hosted debates between Christians and atheists. I've even made response videos to atheists. All of that is available on our channel. Go check it out. Third, I rely on people that see value in my work, people like you that watch videos to the very end, to keep the lights on around here. Literally, this is how I feed my family. So if you see value in the work that I do, please consider supporting this ministry and becoming a patron. Links to that are in the description. Oh, and have I mentioned that Christianity is true?